This is Auntie Up, Indigenous women talking about important shit.
Welcome to Auntie Up, the podcast where Indigenous women's voices are elevated, lifted up, and celebrated for all the important work they do. Shachlein anije es rachlan tagish klinget kuchan tan kwachan iche aguna rajer iche. Hello, I'm Christine Genier. Our guests today are doing some very important work, raising awareness to the climate crisis that we are witnessing and living through right now. I'm here with my co-host, Brandi Morin, who just came back from some time up north and witnessed some of this firsthand. Brandi, thank you for being my co-host today. Danit E, how are you?
Tanse, Christine from Treaty 6 territories. I'm good. I am looking forward to chatting with our incredible guests today because I have been witnessing through my work as a journalist the destruction of our Mother Earth, and it just seems like it's been back to back to back lately. So last month I was at the Fairy Creek blockades happening on Vancouver Island, and there is a battle going on there to protect the ancient forests from being completely decimated. There's a literal war going on there, with police enforcing injunctions for industry and our Mother Earth bearing the brunt of this violence. And a couple of weeks later, I traveled to the Arctic to Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories. And the people in that community are on the front lines of this climate crisis. They're the most affected in all of Canada right now. And they're Inuvialuit people. And they still live off the land completely. They weren't, they were, affected by colonialism and the horrors of the residential school system, but they're still very connected to their lands and waters up there. And it's a daily activity for them. But they are, they're right on the ocean, on the Arctic Ocean, and their shorelines are eroding rapidly. Like, within, the last few years, like 30 to 40 feet has been completely washed away. Some of their homes, have had to be moved, and the whole community is under threat of being washed into the ocean, let alone the impacts that it's having on the, the animals, all of those relatives who depend on the ice and those migration routes and the people that hunt them for sustenance, right? And then I just got back last week from Wet'suwet'en territories, because look at what's happening in BC they're bearing the brunt of all this disaster with the, the wildfires and, the incredible record-breaking heat waves, and now this unprecedented flooding and all the destruction. And then up in the northern part, you have the Wet'suwet'en people who are trying to protect what's left there of their territories, of their lands and waters, and to prevent that catastrophic effects from happening up there. And yet Canada's unleashing a war against them with industry and the police. So it's absolutely insane. So I'm very, very much looking forward to this conversation today. So I have the pleasure of introducing Stephanie Wood. She is a Squamish journalist living and writing in North Vancouver for the Narwhal, which is a pretty badass publication, by the way. In 2020, she was nominated for the Emerging Indigenous Journalist Award by the Canadian Association of Journalists, and she writes stories about Indigenous rights, the arts, sustainability, and social justice. Her best days are spent wandering through the North Shore Mountains or spending time with family. Welcome to Auntie Up, Stephanie.
Hey, Chokstad, thank you so much.
Tasha Beeds is also here. She is a scholar of Nahiao, Scottish, Métis, and Bajan ancestry from the Treaty 6 territories of Saskatoon. She is a mama, a cookum, a poet, a water walker, and is Medewin from Minnewegan Lodge of Russell River First Nation and Wikwemukong unceded territory. Tasha has walked approximately 7,000 kilometers for the water. That's commitment. You want people to hear you.
Yes. More importantly, hear the water.
So we're watching from different corners of this country this frustrating conversation. I use that term with lack of a better one right now. What Brandi was talking about, we are witnessing full on the climate crisis, and in concert with battles against the people who are trying to keep this from progressing further. Tasha, let's start with you. What is a water walker? Why do you walk?
Well, we started walking. I started walking under the guidance of the late grandmother Josephine Ba Mandalman. We put the BA after her name as a marker of the deceased. But she started walking in 2003, trying to raise consciousness about the need to protect the water. She was responding to a call from Three Fires, the late Three Fires head chief, Eddie Ba Benton Benet. And there was a prophecy, and they shared this prophecy in the lodge, and it asked, it had to do with the idea that the water would be worth more than her weight in gold, right? That it would actually become that valuable because she would leave. And that's how within those Medewin teachings, the water is seen as a living being, right? And so Josephine Ba and a number of other Anishinaabe grandmothers, the late chief Eddie Bettenbaugh, he asked the question, like, what are we going to do about it? Because this was a discussion amongst the lodge elders and grandmothers and aunties and grandfathers. And that was how she responded. She said, I'm going to take our water ceremony and I'm going to take it out into the public realm and to those bodies of water so that they know that we as Anishinaabe still remember our responsibilities and obligations to the lands and to the water herself. And so she started walking around. I think Lake Superior was her first, and she walked around each of the Great Lakes. She in total walked approximately 35,000 kilometers. I joined her. My first water walk was back in 2008. And what we do is we take water from that body and we place it into a copper vessel. Copper is very significant in the Medewin tradition, and in amongst Anishinaabe traditionally as well. Copper has always been utilized, but with care, never taking too much of the copper. It's affiliated with the Lake Superior and some of our oral narratives as well. So the copper is also conceptualized as a grandmother. So the water is a feminine entity, the copper is a grandmother, and we place those two together and we carry that in ceremony from the beginning of where the body starts, the headwaters, and then we carry it to where the flow ends. And as we walk, we express our gratitude to the water, we sing, we talk to the water. We have a traditional eagle water staff accompanies the copper vessel and nibe. And traditionally it's the men's role, the men and two-spirit role to carry that staff. And the woman, as the life givers, we carry that copper vessel. And it sounds so simple, right? You're carrying this pail of water. And I remember Josephine Ba also talking about how that kettle or that copper pail was also in honor of all those grandmothers who used to gather water in that way, right? Whether it be through birch bark baskets or other vessels. But at one point, our grandmothers would go to those bodies and lift that water with those vessels, right? So it was also in honor and memory of those old ones that did that. But as we as we move, it is a ceremony first and foremost, and it's a ceremony for the water. But as we move, you're walking. So you're walking across our traditional territories. You're walking in a time like we usually walk. With her, we'd get up at like 3 o'clock in the morning. We'd be out the door by 4 a.m. and be walking all day. And you see the world differently when you're walking it versus driving it. And sadly, you can see firsthand the damage that we as humans are doing to Shkakamekwe, as they say in Anishinaabe, Mother Earth, to the waters. And you pay attention, you notice, right? The animals like the deer, the moose, the bears, the foxes, like they're used to humans being in vehicles, right? And here we are like, just walking. And so you see the world through a different lens. And it's honestly, water walking has changed my life. I owe a debt to the water, and that's why I keep moving. Once you enter into a relationship, right? Our respective Indigenous nations are traditionally built on relationships, not just between us as humans, but with the earth and the water and all of creation. And so when you're in that ceremony, you're reminded, right? You're reminded that we are a part of something much larger than ourselves. And so, it's hard to explain unless you've taken part in it. It's challenging physically, right? The demand is there on our bodies. This past summer, I walked for the Saskatchewan River. And what Brandi was speaking of earlier, we walked for 36 days. We did 1,100 kilometers in 36 days. And we started at the base of the Rocky Mountains where the glaciers are. And it was the most hardest water walk I've ever done, simply because of the impact, the human impact. It's not the animals, it's not the bears or the birds or the insects. It's us as humans. And, as we're walking, I mean, there's that ceremonial element, but we're also educating people. People stop, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And what is that? What are you carrying? And so every opportunity we take that to educate people who engage with us. The other thing that happens is we go through people's traditional territories. And so often those Indigenous nations will host us. And so then we get to speak to the elders, we get to speak to the old ones, the traditional people, and they bring them out to us. And pre-COVID, we would stay in those communities. Post-COVID, we kind of isolated, but we still had that opportunity for engagement. So then that gives us insight as well, right? Like, we're able to hear firsthand the stories of that land that we're walking through. So it's a really powerful ceremony. And we welcome everybody, men, two-spirit, gender fluid, women, Indigenous, non-Indigenous. Anybody can enter into that relationship with the water. But by doing something like a water walk, it's like you activate that ancestral remembrance again, that ancestral knowledge, and you get to know the water on her terms. Often we go, we swim, we take our boats, we fish, we take, and we forget there's a reciprocity there. And so the water walk is about entering into that reciprocal relationship again, the way that our ancestors did.
Wow. Amazing. Hi, Tasha. So, Stephanie, you cover climate change in your work. What's the number one impact this crisis is having on Indigenous communities that you're seeing?
I mean, it's hard to put into words. Basically, there's so much pain across Indigenous communities watching the impact that it is having on their home and on their land. And so often the conversations I'm having with people is about what has been lost. And what is remembered of what used to be there or should be there, people's fears of what else they might lose, especially like salmon, caribou, these relationships they really fear losing. They see the decline and they're just watching it happen, doing everything they can. So no matter what territory someone's from and what relationships they have in that territory, like they're seeing that those are at risk. I just hear so many connections with what Tasha's talking about because, everyone is always connecting it to the fact that they're in a longer fight that their people have been in for a long time, right? Whether it's 200 years or 500 years, depending on where your territory is. And so everyone always still has this resolve, this fight goes on forever. Like we're never giving up. We're doing everything we can in our power to protect our territory. So I always try to include that broader context in any story that I write, that it's not about one stream or one population, one pipeline or anything like that. It's so much bigger. Like Tasha said, we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And so that's something that everyone I speak to really emphasizes.
Wow. So are you impacted by the work you do, and witnessing, this violence to Mother Earth and seeing the impacts it has? How are you impacted?
I still try to do everything I can to amplify and strengthen the Indigenous voices of those that I speak to and really respect people's agencies in telling their own stories and their nation's stories. So often that can be empowering and uplifting. But so often, like I said, those stories are still rooted in so much loss, right? So it can still be really, really impactful. And you can often, like you've said, you see the impact playing out, right? Like there's always images of big trees knocked over on their sides, or we're seeing now salmon are trapped in spots they shouldn't be because of the flooding. So you literally are seeing these images all the time. It's absolutely, absolutely tiring, like definitely tiring. Whenever it starts to get heavy, I try to do that same thing of put it in this bigger context. If it's like, I feel like I'm tired. And you think about what all of our ancestors have gone through to get us to this point. That's kind of what I try to do to put it in perspective whenever I feel tired looking at all of this, looking at all of these things. I would love to also hear with you, because you're looking at the same things, right? And you're going there. You've done so much work in the field.
It's a war zone out there, not only against our mother, but everything goes hand in hand. The war against our people and all the injustices and the human rights violations that our people are facing, they all connect and they all go hand in hand. So when the earth is violated, our people are simultaneously, continually violated. When it comes to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, you have industries that are ripping up the land and violating the land, and governments that are not recognizing Indigenous rights and territories while our women are being raped in the same vicinity and going missing. You have our water that is being contaminated and our people are living in poverty and they cannot consume that water, and our people are standing to protect what is left of the sacred territories. So all of this work is connected, and it's literally a war zone every assignment I go out on. And it's not easy. I usually, when I'm out on an assignment, I have nightmares and I have to take sleeping pills on the road. And it's very difficult because you carry those stories and you carry the people with you. And a lot of times you don't get that release until the story's out there, right? And so you're carrying all of that trauma in your body, especially as an Indigenous person telling the stories, right? So it's just something that you figure out how to deal with along the way, basically.
And now, we'd like to tell you about our sponsors as I share a Know Indigenous History moment. Each week, the team at Know History provides Auntie Up with little-known facts about Indigenous peoples, places, and things. So this moment is to highlight just some of the shit that's been dumped on our Mother Earth, causing this climate crisis that we're in right now. During the Cold War, from 1945 to 1991, the distant early warning line was constructed to detect enemy bombers. It was one of the largest engineering projects of its time. Over 30,000 tons of materials and supplies were shipped to the north, and many of it ended up in landfills, later known as the Dew Dump. We'll post some pictures of that on our socials later. Any sort of environmental cleanup wasn't launched until 1996, but by then, contaminants like asbestos, diesel fuel, lead, and polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, were already in the soil, the water, and the air surrounding those dumps. They remain there to this day, even with millions and millions of dollars spent on cleanup. This project has caused outrageous health, environmental, and financial costs. Know History, who brought you this important factoid, is also a proud sponsor of Auntie Up, the podcast for, by, and about Indigenous women. You can check them out at www.knowhistory.ca.
As you said, Brandi, something that we've been dealing with for generations, Indigenous people, and especially those still connected with the land, have been saying forever, this is coming. And I think a lot of people, maybe too inland or in the larger centers, couldn't see it. They couldn't see the evidence. But this year, we are seeing it. And people still seem to be turning away.
And this is just the beginning. It's about to just get worse.
I think what happens is there's been a forced disconnect, right? Those processes of colonization, it's not like colonization is over. It's still an active force. And so it's a continual battle, right? That there's this force that wants to disconnect our young people, all across Turtle Island. And so we have to work at recreating those connections again, especially for the children and especially for the future generations. You're absolutely right, Brandi. It can be really, really heavy. We saw that in the Saskatchewan River Water Walk. It was like the land was literally drinking from us. We were walking, it was 46 degrees out on the highway, right? Because there was no water. It didn't rain. It rained, I think, one morning we had a bit of a mist, and then there was a downpour when we hit Musqueam for about 5 minutes. But other than that, there was absolutely no rain. When we're in our cars and we're in our homes and our bubbles, we don't necessarily make those connections until it's impacting us immediately, right? And that's colonization. That's colonization at play. But when we walked, we saw, for instance, in the mountains, it was so eerie. There were no animals. There were no caribou, there were no deer, there were no rabbits, there were no insects, there were no birds. And you won't notice it unless you're there and you're inside of it, right? And so we were in the mountains for about 2.5 weeks, and we camped rough camped. So we weren't in a hotel. We're out on, in the bush, in tents, and some of us slept in our vehicles. But it was absolutely so eerie, and it was like a tinderbox. We knew that the fires were going to happen. Literally, the land is telling us what's going to happen. We just have to be able to tune in.
And on the flip side of that, Tasha, of not seeing animals where you should be seeing them, we're now seeing animals move to areas looking for that environment that they can live in.
It's so true. And we saw that. We were visited by 7 bears in total. Grizzly too, because we were in the mountains, right? The grizzly didn't come into the campsite, but the black bears did, and they were starving. I thought he was a dog at first, and I was like, what the heck but then I realized, wait a second, we're in bear country. And when we gazed upon them, I literally broke down crying. That bear was so skinny, you could see the skin hanging. And what had happened was there was a movie crew, and we were in a traditional site. We were in Small Boys, one of Small Boys' traditional sites alongside the highway. And there had been a film crew there, and they had left a mess. They'd left garbage. We picked up after them, but we didn't notice that they buried food in the fire pit. So there was a little bit of food, like a little bit of food in the fire. And that's what the bear was coming for. And initially we were like yelling and screaming and like, get away. But then we were like, wait a second. Like, we're in his territory. Like, we're guests in this bear's territory. And so the pattern that we noticed were all of these bears were becoming habituated to humans, because there was nothing else for them to eat. There were no berries. There were no food. There were no medicines, because the land was so dry. So they became dependent upon the garbage that humans were leaving. Like, oh, it was so horrible. The amount of garbage is insane. And so then they become problem animals, right? So then the park ranger comes in, or whoever, and those animals end up getting shot. So it's this like vicious cycle. But I have to have hope, though. Like, I'm a grandmother. I have 2 grandchildren. And so, and that's where I personally turn to our ways of knowing and being from our respective nations. We literally have the keys to every single issue facing our people. It is a battle. It is a war zone, because we're continually having to assert that we know, we have this knowledge, and all it takes for us to activate that is to enter through the doorways of that our ancestors left us. Like, they left us everything we need. If you're battling addictions and you're battling poverty and you're struggling as a single mom, like, I have the privilege of being a water walker. I'm able to move in ceremony because it's a privilege that I have now as a professor. I don't have any children at home, so I'm able to go for 2-3 months and walk. And so it's a hard tension. But if we can introduce our young people, if we can show them those doorways, to me, that's we have to. Our survival as Indigenous nations depends upon it.
Yeah. And Stephanie, what are you like seeing with the communities that, are affected that you're reporting on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All communities that I'm speaking to are grappling kind of with what Tasha was saying, where it's like what you know needs to be done, like what are priorities for your community and what you actually have the capacity, the time, and the resources to do. It's just a constant struggle for every community that I speak to, but everyone is literally doing everything that they can. So everyone is setting different kind of priorities. So some are really focusing on, pushing for an Indigenous protected area. So we see that in Genier territory, they got tired of waiting for the province to actually cooperate, and they just declared their own IPCA. Telokriat on the Vancouver Island are pursuing their own Indigenous protected area. So for some, that's the priority. For others, they're trying to revive traditional fishing techniques, and that ties into fish monitoring, actually being able to see how these populations are doing. So that's something that the health sec are doing really well. And they're having a look at really close looks at how rivers are doing, like water levels and temperatures. And so some are really prioritizing fish, and some are really prioritizing caribou. Tsleil-Waututh opened the biggest solar farm on the North Shore just last year here in North Vancouver. They're focusing on clean energy and also how to adapt their community for climate change. So they're right on the water, right across from the Trans Mountain, and they're already seeing the water is rising, and they're right on the edge. So they're creating plans. What are we going to do to make sure to keep people safe? So definitely every community I speak to has different priorities and a million goals and so many plans of what they want to do, and everybody who has so many ideas and wants to do it.
You know, it's part of, I believe, our role in this era to stand and protect our territories and our mother for the future of the world, honestly. And are you seeing people step into those roles on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone is, everyone has different influences and platforms, right? Everyone I speak to is trying to find a way to basically make the world know that is our role and our ability and the amount of knowledge that we all have. I spoke to some people who went to COP26 and were just there to really make sure everybody knows that Indigenous peoples have the knowledge, have the ways, have the ideas, are out there on the territory actually seeing what's going on in their territories, right? Like there's just big swaths of areas that the government doesn't even know what's going on in, like they don't have people monitoring. They don't know how things are doing, whether it's populations or erosion, like all of those things. And so, establishing guardians programs is a big thing that you're seeing where people are where First Nations are saying this is what we have always done. And what we're meant to do is just being out on the territory, knowing what's going on, maintaining those relationships, and also the fact that that is literally a livelihood on its own, that it's actually worth that. That's one of the biggest things I see happening is everyone either is starting one or has one or is planning for one. Everyone is, and I really love that because then you speak to guardians who are saying I know my territory now in a way that I didn't before. I'm learning so much. Yeah. And they're saying that they now know how to get to each place. They now know the types of trees and the names for places and the types of plants. And it's that's definitely one of the uplifting things that I get to hear.
That is so awesome.
Yeah.
Brandi, I introduced you as my co-host, but if you don't mind, I would like to direct this question to you as well as to our guests, Tasha and Stephanie. You, the women here who I'm speaking with are carrying very, very heavy stuff. And they're doing it not just for themselves, but for all of us. How are you taking care of yourself?
That's something that I'm figuring out. I just came back from a war zone a few days ago, and honestly, waking up in the middle of the night, shooting up out of bed with nightmares, dealing with the trauma, I'm just trying to figure it out. Honestly, it's not sustainable. I use prayer. My kokum is gone, so I don't really have an elder or really anybody to speak to. I have, supports, but I think I get a lot of inspiration from seeing these other women that are out there. Seeing these Wet'suwet'en matriarchs who've been out on the land and they're so peaceful and they're so strong. I get inspiration from them and strength from them and connecting and meeting people like you guys, because we are all in this together and we're doing our own parts. How about you, Tasha?
I rely upon those relationships. If I'm struggling, I will go to the water and I will talk to her. I'll go to the land. I'll make my offerings. I'll call upon my ancestors. I have relationships with healthy people. I have circles and circles. My lodge. Without my lodge, I would not be sitting here in front of you today. I wouldn't have made it. Belonging to that society. I have a whole family. I have aunties and uncles. I've got nieces and nephews, more grandchildren. We're not connected biologically, but we are connected spiritually. And that really is for me, that's where I go. That's where I go to clean myself off. If I need healing, the people will do that for me. My lodge sisters, my lodge brothers will, they'll do a ceremony specifically for us, whether it be a sweat or cleaning off or singing. I'm a traditional singer in that sense. And so, I draw upon those traditional ways. And I also have counseling. We carry that trauma. You're absolutely right, Brandi. And it can get stuck. Every single person I know that has conducted a water walk has been diagnosed with cancer.
What? Because they're taking it on, because their bodies are absorbing that.
Yeah, on a spiritual level. Yeah. And that translates to a physical.
Yes.
I really believe that. And so when you're conscious of that, you have to take the steps. Our ancestors were in incredible physical shape. I follow some friends of mine. They run a site called Creator's Garden, and he talks about that. He talks about how we need to ensure our bodies are at a tip-top shape, right? And so, decolonizing our diet, decolonizing the approach to food. He talks about things like intermittent fasting, the way eating the ways that our ancestors did. For Plains Cree and Anishinaabeg people, it was like a lot of meat. We didn't have a lot of plants. We ate meat and berries. And when I was preparing for the water walk, they were actually my advisors. So that's another way, right, is to enter into a relationship with our food, and be cognizant, right? Be cognizant that, are you ready, right? Because if something happens, as we saw on the West Coast, right, everything is connected. If the water leaves, there's going to be issues with food security, right? And so you have to prepare. For me, one of the messages that came through the water and through the ceremony of the water walk was that we need to get our children ready. And so traditional means, people hear about fasting as a ceremony, but it's also training. It's also discipline and training. If you go 4 days without food and water, if you can't get something to eat for 24 hours, you're not going to collapse because you've been trained. You can go, you can go without food or water for 4 days. And so things like that, when I started looking at myself in relation to the physical elements of the ceremony that I was entering into, I looked at that. I was like, these old ceremonies are not just doorways to that spiritual level. They were actual physical training. And it's the same with the water walk, right? I know I can walk 1,100 kilometers in 36 days. I know I can physically, mentally, I know I can do that. So if we're ever in a situation where I have to walk for more than a day or two, I know I'm good. I can do that, right? And I think that we really have to look at that. We hear the word holistic, but it really is. You have to look after the spiritual part of yourself, the emotional part. I have a counselor that I see. I'm going through non-Indigenous counseling methods with Indigenous people, though. I think that's important. Looking at how are you treating your body? Are you sleeping? Are you feeding your body well? Are you exercising? And then, mentally, what's going on in your mind? How can you get to that place where you can sit on the land and just be with the land and the water? So those are some of my strategies.
Thank you so much. How about you, Steph?
Yeah, no, I feel like I so related to what you said earlier, kind of still figuring it out. And I feel like everything Tasha said was so beautiful, and there's some there's definitely overlaps. So for me, spending time with my family is absolutely just so nourishing. Because like I said, Brandi, you as well, we often are covering stories of Indigenous people who are going through pain and oppression. And as much as you also lift up their strength, there's still so much pain there. And so to be, I just was like recently at White Spot with two of my aunties, and just like and they've been through a lot too. And just to be with them and hear their laughter and joking and sit around and enjoy like a cup of tea, literally nothing can bring me to that level like that. Being in spaces like this too, and I just joined another circle of Indigenous women talking about what it's like to be in the workplace, especially when you're not in like an Indigenous-led workplace and you're often kind of like the only one. And being in that circle, once again, just totally lifts me up. And also, yes, getting out on the land, getting to your favorite places, just no matter our land has been very urbanized, but you can still get to any creek, you can still go to significant areas. And just recently, I just took up hide tanning this year. That's been one of the most incredible things. And I was at my papa's house, and I was scraping a hide for the very first time this spring. It was amazing.
That is so, so good. I totally agree. Going to the land, I lived just outside of Edmonton, and when I need a breather, I go to the river in the summer, or I take off to the mountains. And this summer I'm going for 2 weeks up north to stay with my family in their cabins out on the land, because that is the only medicine we need. And I'm taking my kids, and it is the way to go.
It is. Yeah. At that day I was, scraping my first hide, and my mom was there watching, and I was thinking to myself, this is where our people did it. This is where we did it. Here at on our reserve where we've always been, and it literally was such an overwhelming feeling. So yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for being a part. And again, asking you to slice off just another piece into this really heavy conversation always deserves a lot more time than anything that we can do in these kinds of formats. And I look forward to being able to come back to this conversation. Before we do wrap up, I want to give a shout out to some folks here in my territory, what's known as the Yukon, the Vantat Quichin, in the northernmost community of Old Crow in the Yukon, Chief Dana Tisha Tram, folks like Lorraine Nitro, Norma Cassie, who have been fighting for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, fighting against drilling there, have made that a lifelong battle. To all my relations, Ashgachlan here in the Yukon, who are fighting, and to the Tegashro, our big river, Chunikwan, known famously as the Yukon River. Thank you, Shroni, Tasha, and Stephanie, and Brandi, for all of the work that you are doing and continue to do for us. And please, please take good care of yourselves. Mm-hmm. And go ahead, Brandi.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Remember to follow us and like us on the socials, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. We do drop a new episode every Monday. And when these heavy topics got you feeling down, just remember, Auntie Up.
Auntie Up is produced by Jolene Banning, Kim Wheeler, and Sam Makwa for Makwa Creative. Our executive producer is Tanya Talaga. Our partner is Antica Productions. Auntie Up is sponsored by No History and Anna Mickey, Indigenous innovation since 2003. Follow and like us on socials at Auntie Up Podcast on Facebook, Auntie.up on Instagram, and Auntie Up 1 on Twitter.